They say every man has a moment that defines the rest of his life. For Jon Snow, that moment came not in Castle Black, but in Winterfell, on a cold morning when the snow hadn't stopped falling for 3 days. He stood near the stables, Ghost at his side, looking at the road north, the one he was supposed to take, the one that led to the wall, to the Night's Watch, to duty. But he didn't take it. The letter had come the night before. Robb had slipped it under his chamber door in the dead of night, no seal, just his brother's familiar scrawl. Their father, Eddard Stark, was gone, taken south with the king, and the look in Robb's eyes at breakfast said it all. He was scared, and he didn't want to rule alone. "I'll understand if you leave," Robb had said with that stiff, lordly tone he was just starting to grow into. "But I'd rather not do this without you." Jon hadn't answered then. He only nodded like he always did. But something shifted in him. He didn't feel like a Stark. He wasn't a Stark, but he was still a son of the North. And maybe that was enough. So instead of riding north with Benjen Stark that dawn, Jon turned back toward the keep. The black cloak folded neatly on his bed remained untouched. And so did his oath. That decision didn't make waves at first. Life in Winterfell adjusted fast. The bastard boy, who had always stood at the edge of the family table, now found himself at council meetings, beside Robb. Some of the bannermen didn't like it. Old men who muttered about snowblood and baseborn advice, but they kept their complaints quiet. Jon had always had that stillness in him, like his father, and Ghost's red eyes didn't invite many arguments. Catelyn was colder than ever. She barely spoke to Jon, barely even looked at him. He caught her once, whispering with Maester Luwin, words like illegitimate influence and dangerous sentiment echoing down the hall. But Robb didn't waver, and neither did Jon. At first, Jon thought he'd made the right decision. He trained with the guard, helped manage the keep, rode on patrols through the Wolfswood. He felt useful, valued, not just some unwanted name on a family tree. But something haunted him, dreams, dark ones. He saw ice cracking underfoot, shadows crawling over white fields, and blue eyes staring through the dark. The wall came to him in sleep, towering and broken. He saw fire, heard screams, felt cold air that burned his lungs. He would wake with sweat pouring down his back, Ghost growling low beside him. He didn't tell anyone. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him anyway. Then came the ravens. First whispers from the Night's Watch, wildlings gathering, rangers vanishing. Then silence. Benjen never sent another letter. Old Bear Mormont stopped writing too. And then one cold morning a rider came, alone, his horse half dead, black cloak frozen stiff to his shoulders. His lips were blue, his words broken, but they understood enough. The wall was under attack. From what, he couldn't say, just death. Robb called the banners that night. The lords of the north rode in within days, Karstark, Umber, Manderley, all ready to march south, thinking of war against the Lannisters for their father. But Robb halted them. "We may not have a father to come home to," he said grimly, "if there's no north left to come home from." And there, in the great hall of Winterfell, Jon stood beside Robb, no longer just the bastard son. No longer a watcher on the wall, a Stark in everything but name. And now, a commander. He had chosen the north, but the wall was paying the price. The wind screamed louder the further they rode. Snow fell like a curtain across the world, swallowing sound, muffling the creak of saddles and the breath of men. Jon led the scouting party beyond the last hearth, the last stretch of civilization before the true wild began. Beneath him, his horse shifted uneasily, hooves crunching through icy slush that hadn't thawed in weeks. Ghost padded silently at his side, white against white, nearly invisible but for those bloody red eyes. They hadn't seen a soul in 2 days. Not a ranger, not a wildling, not even a raven. Jon kept his sword close, gloved hand tight on the hilt. His eyes scanned the trees, watching, always watching. Something in the woods felt wrong. Not just empty, wrong, like something had walked through and stripped the land of sound and breath and warmth. He couldn't shake the memory of the rider who had reached Winterfell. His face twisted in terror even as he died, gasping about shadows with eyes like frost. It had sounded mad at the time, but now— "Jon," said Sir Roderick beside him, pulling his cloak tighter. "We should turn back." The men grow nervous. "They should," Jon said quietly without turning. "This far north we're not alone. We just can't see it yet." Sir Roderick frowned. "What are we even hoping to find?" "Survivors," Jon answered. "Answers." But deep down he knew it was more than that. He was looking for Benjen, or at least what was left of him. They rode until night fell like a hammer, dark and total. The moon offered no help. Clouds smothered it from view. They made camp in a shallow hollow, posted double guards, lit no fires. Even breathing too loud felt dangerous. Jon didn't sleep. He sat with his back against a tree, hand resting on Ghost's fur. The direwolf was tense, silent, his body low, ears flicking at the smallest sound. And then it happened. A scream, not human, something sharp and inhuman, echoing through the trees like a blade through bone. Every man was on his feet in an instant, swords drawn, eyes wild. "Form up!" Jon barked. "Shields together!" They barely had time to react before the first one came. Tall, pale, eyes like polished ice. Its armor shimmered faintly, not like steel but glass, deadly and cold. It moved silently, effortlessly, and the first swing of its sword cut clean through man and shield alike. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, horses screamed. Jon leapt forward without thinking, Longclaw in hand. He clashed with the creature, the Valyrian steel ringing as it met that icy blade. The shock of the strike numbed his arm. But he held. Ghost leapt onto another, tearing at its throat, and the thing let out a terrible wail before crumbling into shards of ice. "Valyrian steel!" Jon shouted to the others. "Only that or dragonglass. Nothing else will work." But it was too late for most. The attackers moved like shadows through the storm, cutting through the Northmen like wheat. Sir Roderick went down with a blow to the gut, trying to protect a younger boy who never had a chance. Jon killed one, then another, but there were too many. And the dead didn't stay dead. The ones the cold blades touched began to twitch, his blue eyes flickering open. They were being turned. Jon knew then this wasn't a skirmish. It was an invasion. "Fall back!" he yelled, parrying a strike that nearly took his head. "South! Ride south! Warn Robb!" He barely escaped. Fewer than 10 men rode out with him. Ghost was bloodied but alive, his white fur red and steaming in the snow. As they galloped back toward Winterfell, Jon's heart pounded with guilt and fear. He had chosen not to go to the wall. He had chosen to stay and serve the North. And now the North was at war with death itself. And it might be too late. Winterfell stood quiet under heavy snow, its walls blanketed white, its towers looking more like tombstones than battlements. The castle had always felt cold to Jon, but now it seemed colder still, like the frost had crept inside the stone itself and settled into the bones of every man within. When Jon returned, he brought more than just news. He brought the stench of death. Robb met him in the courtyard, surrounded by bannermen and guards, his face pale, jaw tight. The 10 riders who followed Jon in looked broken, bloodied, silent, eyes full of horror. Ghost limped behind, snarling at every movement like he expected the dead to come crawling out from under the snow. Jon dismounted slowly, barely feeling the pain in his side, where a blade had scraped his ribs. Robb approached, his eyes scanning his brother's face like he was trying to read a language he no longer understood. "What happened?" he asked, voice low. "They're real," Jon said. "White walkers, whites, all of it." Murmurs swept through the gathered men like wildfire. Some scoffed. Some crossed themselves. Others turned pale. "We were ambushed near the Weeping Ridge," Jon continued. "Sir Roderick is dead." Half the men rose again before they hit the ground. "I saw Benjen's horse, but not him." "You're sure?" Robb asked. "Sure they were. I killed one," Jon said. "With Longclaw, it shattered, like glass. And the others—" he shook his head. "Steel won't stop them. Fire does. Dragonglass, maybe. But ordinary swords are useless. They're not just raiding anymore. They're coming." Robb was silent for a moment. Then he looked at the others. "Get Maester Luwin. Send ravens to every bannerman, and to the Vale, the Riverlands, anyone who'll listen. Tell them the dead walk. And what if they laugh?" Someone muttered. Let them, Robb said. They won't be laughing when Winterfell's the last castle standing. By nightfall, the castle was in full motion. Blacksmiths were working round the clock, reforging what they could. The old stores of obsidian daggers, collected long ago by some superstitious Stark ancestor, were dusted off and counted. Men were assigned fire duties. Watchtowers lit torches constantly. Jon sat alone in the godswood, Longclaw across his lap, his hands trembling. The weirwood trees stared at him, red eyes bleeding into the snow. He spoke softly. "I should have gone to the wall." Ghost whined beside him as if answering. The tree didn't. Later that night, Catelyn Stark came to him. She stood at the edge of the godswood path, cloaked, her face partly shadowed. She hadn't spoken a word to Jon in weeks. But now she looked tired. Not angry, just worn. "You brought death back with you," she said coldly. Jon didn't flinch. It was coming either way. She nodded once, slowly. "Maybe so." Then she turned and left. No forgiveness, no warmth. Just a statement. A truth neither of them could undo. The next day, more ravens returned, some bearing grim confirmation. Eastwatch by the sea was silent. The Shadow Tower hadn't sent word in weeks. Even Castle Black had stopped responding. Jon stood on the battlements of Winterfell that night, watching the horizon. No stars, no moon. Just cold clouds rolling in like waves of smoke. And then he saw it. A flicker in the far north. Not fire, movement. It came slowly at first. A dark line stretching across the distant hills. And then more. Figures, shadows, thousands, too many to count. Too quiet to be men. The dead had begun their march. Jon turned and shouted to the men. The bells rang out across Winterfell. War had come. And it brought no mercy. The first blow didn't come with a roar. It came with silence. The wind stopped. The clouds stilled. And then, like a whisper slipping through the cracks of the world, the chill deepened. Not cold like winter, cold like death. Jon stood on the outer wall, looking down at the white sea of corpses, stretching from tree line to horizon. The undead didn't march. They drifted, slowly, like a tide that knew it couldn't be stopped. Robb stood beside him, armored in dark steel, the direwolf sigil gleaming across his chest. His breath came out in clouds, but his voice was steady. "They don't stop to eat. They don't rest. They don't bleed. How do we fight something that isn't alive?" Jon gripped the stone in front of him, eyes hard. "We burn them." All around the walls, men poured pitch into barrels, set torches to the pyres they'd built along the inner courtyard. The forges ran day and night, crafting fire arrows, oil bombs, anything that could buy them time. The blacksmiths were burning their hands from overwork. The Maester had gone hoarse from tending the wounded already, but nothing could prepare them for what came next. It began with a scream. One of the watchmen, just a boy, maybe 15, was looking through a spyglass when he let out a sound no one should ever make. They rushed to him only to find his mouth open, lips blue, eyes wide. The boy was dead, frozen stiff, still standing. Jon stepped to the edge and looked out and saw them. White Walkers, tall, elegant, inhuman. Blue eyes like burning stars in cracked porcelain faces. They moved through the army of dead like kings among cattle, untouched by snow or wind. And then one of them raised a hand. The dead charged. The first wave hit the walls like a crashing sea. Arrows fell by the hundreds. Pitch was lit. Fire rolled down the slopes of Winterfell, lighting corpses ablaze. But they kept coming, screaming, crawling, climbing over one another like rats, burning, dying, rising again. Jon moved through the chaos like a ghost, Longclaw swinging, cutting down anything that came too close. Ghost fought beside him, savage and silent, fur blackened with blood and ash. Everywhere Jon looked, death reigned. Robb fought too. Not from behind, at the front. Sword in hand, leading charges, pulling wounded men back with his bare hands. He looked like a Stark. He looked like their father. But bravery didn't matter when the enemy didn't feel fear. By the second night, the dead had breached the first wall. Jon ordered a retreat to the keep. Flames lit the sky like the sun. Smoke covered the moon. Bodies, burning, frozen, twitching, littered every path, every tower, every inch of Winterfell's courtyards. Inside the great hall they regrouped. Only a few hundred remained. Robb slumped against the throne, blood soaking through his armor, his eyes distant. "How long?" he asked Jon, voice rough. Jon shook his head. "We won't see a third night." "Not without help." "Help from where?" Robb said bitterly. "The south. They don't even believe us?" Jon stared into the fire, jaw clenched. "There's one place." Robb turned to him slowly. "No, they have dragons," Jon said. "They have fire. If they won't come north, then I'll go south." "You'll die," Robb snapped. "We need you here." "If I stay," Jon said, "we all die." There was a silence between them then, not of argument but of truth. Jon Snow had made his choice once, and the wall had paid the price. He couldn't make that mistake again. Before dawn, he rode out alone, southbound, with Ghost at his side, leaving a dying Winterfell behind. The bastard wolf had chosen the north once. Now he was choosing fire. The King's Road was no longer safe. Not that it ever truly had been, but now it was different. It was quieter. Too quiet. Villages were abandoned. Farms left with tools still stuck in the ground. Dead animals frozen mid-stride. A silence thick enough to choke on. Jon rode fast, pushing his horse harder than he should have. Ghost always nearby, ears alert, hackles raised. He kept his sword unsheathed. Every shadow looked like death, every gust of wind like a warning. And behind him, somewhere behind him, Winterfell burned. He hadn't looked back since the second night. He didn't think he could bear to. By the time he reached Moat Cailin, the sky was red with smoke from some distant fire. The garrison there had been wiped out. No survivors, only bones and blackened steel. Some had been burned, others not. He recognized one of the Stark banners, half buried in snow, soaked in old blood. Jon didn't linger. He rode harder. He had to reach Daenerys. She was the only one left who had fire. Real fire and dragons, if she was still alive, if she would even listen to him. But the South didn't care about the North. Not really. By the time he reached White Harbor, the gates were barred and the guards wouldn't let him pass until he dropped his hood. Even then, they looked at him with suspicion. His clothes were blackened and torn, his eyes bloodshot, his face gaunt. "You look like death," the gate captain said. "I've seen it," Jon replied. Inside, the city was tense. Refugees from the north crowded the streets. Merchants argued over bread prices. And yet the lords feasted behind guarded doors, still debating who should wear a crown while the world froze. Jon didn't stay. He left that night, sailing south on a fishing boat manned by men too drunk or too desperate to care who he was. Every mile took him further from home. Every wave felt like betrayal. He reached Dragonstone after 10 days of rough seas and sleepless nights. The island rose from the mist like something from a dream or a nightmare. The guards didn't recognize him. He looked more like a beggar than a warrior. But when he mentioned Daenerys and dragons and the north burning, they took him in. Not kindly, but they took him. They led him through the castle halls, past black stone and smoking torches, into a room that still smelled faintly of ash and fire. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the window, her silver hair braided, her back straight. When she turned to face him, Jon nearly collapsed. She looked just as he remembered, but colder, more distant, more queen than woman. "Jon Snow," she said, "you've come south after all." "I didn't have a choice," Jon said, his voice rasping. "They're here." Daenerys tilted her head. "The White Walkers?" Jon nodded. "Winterfell is gone." That struck her. For a moment her expression cracked. She stepped forward. "Robb?" Jon looked away. "Holding, if he's still alive." Silence heavy, painful. Then she stepped closer. "Why now, Jon Snow? Why ask for my help after ignoring my letters? After refusing to kneel?" "Because the North is dead without fire," he said simply. "And you have fire." She studied him. "You ask me to save a land that doesn't want me, to burn for people who would spit on my name." "I'm not asking for them," Jon said. "I'm asking for what's right." For a long time she said nothing. Then she turned and looked out over the sea. "You're lucky. If you'd come a day later, you wouldn't have found me here." "Why?" "I was preparing to sail," she said. "To King's Landing." Jon's eyes narrowed. "To take the Iron Throne?" "Yes," she replied. "But now, perhaps I should take the North instead." Jon didn't move. And then came the roar, a great thundering cry from the cliffs beyond. A dragon's cry. He stepped to the window and saw Drogon, still alive, still massive, fire in his eyes. Jon took a deep breath. Winter had brought death, but fire still burned. Now they had to decide where to unleash it. The flight north was unlike anything Jon had ever experienced. Riding a dragon wasn't just flying, it was surrender. Drogon didn't move like a horse or a ship. He didn't obey reins. He didn't tolerate fear. He flew with fury, wings like mountains slashing through the sky, the wind screaming so loud it tore through Jon's thoughts like a blade. Daenerys flew beside him on Rhaegal, her silver hair snapping like a banner in the wind. She didn't look at him, not once. She had agreed to come, but not for him. Not for the North. For the living, she had said. But Jon knew the truth. She was coming for fire. For the battle. And maybe for the crown that would be left behind if the North truly burned. And they flew low over desolate villages, abandoned roads, frozen lakes cracked like shattered glass. The landscape had changed. The North was dying. Not from war, from something deeper, something older. The snow never stopped now, not for a moment. When they reached Winterfell, the castle was nearly buried. One of the main towers had collapsed. The outer wall was nothing but jagged stone, but the flames still burned in the courtyards, and the banners still flew. Jon's heart twisted. They were still holding. He landed hard in the godswood, sliding off Drogon before the beast had fully settled. Ghost met him first, tail wagging low, muzzle blood-stained. The dire wolf was thinner now, rougher, but alive. Robb stood in the hall, surrounded by fewer men than Jon remembered. His armor was cracked, his hand bandaged, and there was a long, tired shadow under his eyes. When he saw Jon, something broke. "Just for a moment?" "About damn time," Robb muttered, then embraced him without another word. Daenerys entered behind them, flanked by Unsullied, her dragons circling above like gods of fire. The look she and Robb exchanged was cold, distrustful, icy, even in this frozen world. "She's here to help," Jon said quickly. "We burn or we freeze." Robb didn't argue. There was no strength left for politics. Winterfell had become a tomb of the living. The wounded outnumbered the healthy. Fires never went out. Food was nearly gone. They were eating salted horse meat and bitter roots. And still, every night the dead came, in waves, but now they had fire. The dragons tore through the next assault like storm winds. Their fire lit up the night like a second sun. Screaming whites disintegrated in waves, their icy bones cracking like dry wood. For the first time in weeks, the living held the line. But it wasn't enough, because then they saw him, at the edge of the forest, tall, crowned with frost, eyes like frozen oceans, the Night King. He didn't attack. He didn't scream or charge or rage. He simply stood and raised one hand, and behind him a second army rose. Jon saw the bodies, ones they'd burned, ones they hadn't, dead men, dead women, soldiers they'd lost in the first nights. And then a sound that made Jon's stomach drop. A roar, a dead roar, Viserion, the third dragon, risen from ice, breathing frost. Jon turned to Daenerys. Her face had gone pale, her lips trembling. "He took him," she whispered.
"He took my child."
Jon looked at her and for the first time saw something terrifying in her eyes. Not grief, rage. "I'll burn them all," she whispered, "even if it burns me too." Jon stepped back. Robb watched them both, the Dragon Queen and the bastard wolf, and saw the war that was coming inside the war they were already fighting. There were too many dead, and too much fire. Winter was no longer coming. It was here. The sky over Winterfell was no longer black. It burned gold and orange, streaked with fire and ash as dragons warred in the heavens. Rhaegal clashed with the risen Viserion in mid-air, claws raking against undead flesh, fire and frost lighting up the frozen fields below like a battlefield between gods. Jon stood at the center of the courtyard, face smeared with blood and ash, watching his worst nightmare unfold. Every second more men died. Every second the fire burned hotter, and the ice crept closer. Daenerys had stopped listening. She had mounted Drogon the moment Viserion appeared. Screaming something in Valyrian, she had shot into the sky like a falling star in reverse, chasing after the monster that had once been her child. But this wasn't a rescue. It was revenge. Jon had begged her to wait, to plan, to fight smart, but her eyes had turned to fire, and nothing he said could cool it. Not now, maybe not ever again. Robb fought at the gate, his sword arm numb, his men down to less than 100. The dead never stopped. They climbed over each other, tore through flame, walked on burning limbs just to reach warm flesh. Every man who fell rose again. They were running out of oil, running out of arrows, running out of time. Then came the second breach, the gate to the crypts. They had hidden the women and children there, the old and the sick. It was supposed to be safe, but the dead didn't just rise outside the walls. They rose beneath them too. Jon heard the screams before he saw the smoke. He turned, and his soul cracked. The crypts were burning. He ran, shoving past soldiers, leaping over rubble, ignoring shouted warnings. Ghosts stayed behind, too wounded to follow. Jon's lungs burned. His legs bled, but he didn't stop. Inside the crypts it was madness. Stone coffins cracked open. Stark ancestors with dust in their bones and ice in their veins clawed at anything that moved. Daenerys' dragonfire, in some mad twist of fate, had burned through part of the walls, letting light in, but also bringing chaos. Jon cut down a child once named Lyanna, or something wearing her face. He found old Maester Luwin torn in half, eyes still open. He screamed for anyone alive. And then he saw her, Sansa, bloodied, cornered, holding a dagger in both hands, face streaked with tears and dirt, but unbroken. She didn't flinch when Jon appeared. She stabbed the white in front of her, and then ran to him. They didn't speak. There wasn't time. He pulled her close, shielded her as the crypt roof groaned and cracked above them. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. She laughed bitterly. "You either." They ran, back toward the stairs, back toward what little hope remained. Outside, the air was thunder and dragonfire. Rhaegal was down. Jon saw him fall, wings shredded, neck bleeding. Not dead, not yet, but down. Drogon flew wild in the air, but Viserion had disappeared into the clouds. The Night King was nowhere to be seen. Jon ran to Robb, dragging Sansa with him. "We can't hold it," Robb shouted. "We fall tonight!" Jon looked up at the tower. "Then we burn it!" "What?"
The castle.
"The gods would, all of it. We torch the dead with the living if we have to." Robb stared at him, mouth open. Sansa did too. "Jon, we can't let him take the north. We can't let him take Winterfell. Not again." And that's when Daenerys landed. Drogon crashed into the courtyard, tail swinging, smoke pouring from his nostrils. She climbed down, cloak torn, hair scorched, eyes burning. "He's gone," she said. "He's heading south." "What?" Jon stepped forward. "What do you mean, south? The north isn't his goal?" "He doesn't want to rule the north," Daenerys said, almost in a whisper. "He wants to kill the blood of dragons." Then she looked at Jon. "You." Jon froze, and then he understood. The wall, the crypts, the dragons. It wasn't about castles. It was about him, about his blood. "I was never supposed to stay in Winterfell," Jon whispered. "This is my fault." The Night King wasn't just after the north. He was coming for Jon Snow, and now he was heading straight for King's Landing. They rode hard. Jon, Daenerys, Robb, and what remained of Winterfell's strength left the castle smouldering behind them. What had once been the heart of the north now stood hollowed and broken. Its stones were blackened with fire. Its people were scattered bones. But it had served its purpose. It had held. Barely. Southward they went, chasing death. The road to King's Landing had become a graveyard. Villages were emptied. Entire towns vanished without blood, without sound. Just silence and the cold. The farther they rode, the warmer the air should have been, but it wasn't. It stayed biting, unnatural. Spring would not come, because the Night King was already there. Scouts returned from the King's Road with madness in their eyes. Smoke rose from the east. The gold cloaks were dead. The city gates frozen over, walls rimmed with ice. The Red Keep stood untouched, but the streets below had become a hunting ground for the dead. And the bells had not rung. No warning, no mercy, just death. By the time Jon and Daenerys reached the hill overlooking King's Landing, the full horror stood before them. The city was gone, not in ruin but in stillness. Not a single torch burned, no footsteps echoed, no market sounds, no cries. Just quiet, like the whole place had frozen in time. Then came the roar. Viserion, he soared overhead, frost trailing from his wings, his blue fire freezing towers into shards. He landed atop the great sept, wings wide, screaming with a sound that cracked stone. And beside him, standing on the highest peak of the Red Keep, arms outstretched, cloak whipping in the wind, was the Night King. He looked down on the last of the living like a god. Jon dismounted. Longclaw gleamed at his hip. He walked forward slowly, not speaking, not afraid. Daenerys grabbed his arm. "You can't go alone." Not speaking, not afraid. Daenerys grabbed his arm. "You can't go alone." "This is between him and me," Jon said. "No," she said. "This is between us and him." She turned to Drogon, mounted with a grace that no longer looked human, and launched into the sky. Jon moved through the ruined gates, through streets littered with frozen corpses, until he reached the square before the Red Keep. And there they waited. The Night King descended slowly, silently, steps light as snow. His face betrayed no emotion, no hatred, no fear. Jon raised his sword. Daenerys circled overhead, Drogon snarling with fury. The Night King looked at Jon, then past him, then up at the dragon. He raised one hand. Jon screamed, "Now!" Drogon dove. Flames roared down. Fire engulfed the square. For 1 second, just one, the night turned to day. But when the flames died, the Night King still stood untouched. He looked up, then down, and smiled. He could not be burned. He raised both arms, and from every alley, every broken door, the dead rose. Thousands. Robb charged through the gates, northern men behind him, unsullied to his flanks. The battle erupted into chaos. Steel clashed. Men screamed. Fire rained from above. And still the Night King walked forward toward Jon. Jon charged. Longclaw met ice. Sparks flew. The sound was like thunder. Again, again. Jon fought with everything he had. He thought of Robb, of Arya, of Sansa, of Ned, of Ygritte, of Ghost, of every man who had died so he could live. He fought for the living, but he was losing. The Night King's strength was inhuman. His strikes broke stone. His blade shattered shields. Jon barely kept pace, every parry shaking his bones. And then a scream. Drogon was falling. He crashed into the palace courtyard, wing torn, blood pouring like lava. Daenerys screamed from his back, tumbling into stone. She rose slowly, staggering, blood on her face. The Night King turned. He raised his hand. Jon saw it. He knew what it meant. He would kill her. Raise her. Use her. No. Jon dropped Longclaw. He ran. He threw himself in front of her and took the strike meant for her heart. The Night King's blade drove through his chest. Daenerys screamed. The world froze. And then the Night King stumbled. He looked down. The dagger, the dragonglass dagger Jon had hidden in his palm, driven up under the ribs, into the heart. The Night King looked Jon in the eyes, and shattered. Ice exploded. The dead froze in place, then crumbled. All around the battlefield the whites fell. Silence, then cheers, then tears. Robb dropped to his knees. Ghost howled, long and low. Daenerys crawled to Jon's side, cradled his body, shaking. He looked up at her, barely alive, eyes fading. "I told you!" "I shouldn't have stayed." She shook her head. Don't say it." He coughed, blood. "You have to. Lead now, promise me." She said nothing, just held him tighter. His eyes closed. The bastard wolf was gone, but the war was over. In the days that followed, the snow began to melt. King's Landing was rebuilt, not with gold but with memory. The Iron Throne remained empty, for no one could claim it without standing in the shadow of Jon Snow's sacrifice. They called him many things: the Wolf of Winter, the Dragon's Shield, the Bastard King. But the name that echoed loudest through the new realm was simple: the man who saved the living. And in the north, where winter finally broke, a dire wolf stood watch on the wall, howling into the wind, waiting for the one who never came home. Waiting for the one who never came home.